Hello. I'm very glad to be here with you and have this opportunity to respond, encourage this fantastic project that you are all involved in. It's also very exciting and agreeable for me to be part of an unlearning talk. Why do I find unlearning to be something that's so exciting is that the world around us changes in ways that invite, but don't always make easy, forgetting the way we did things in the past. And I think today it is pretty obvious to everyone that when certain changes take place, such as a pandemic shock, the images of the future that we use change. And because these images change, we actually see the world around us in different ways. And then we can begin to think about doing things differently, things that we could have done yesterday differently, but we just didn't think about doing it that way. So I want to talk a little bit about how the world around us, all of us really, are grappling with this. And it's something that the 20th century kind of set us up for now that we're in the 21st. And let me begin with an image, since this is about cultural and the stories that we tell ourselves, with the kind of stories that we hear so often. Here come the robots, the fear of the future. This is something that's been recurrent. It's a story that's happened over and over for the last 200 years. And of course, we have the important and powerful image, which is based on forecasting and very serious and well-established scientific efforts to see how the climate of the world might change. And it creates an image of the future and stories that we tell about what that image means. In the world of futures thinking and speculation, which could be speculative design or speculative fiction, so connected to the cultural world and imagination and invention. There's also the very famous Isaac Asimov, who wrote a very important, from the point of view of the science fiction community, a series of books called Foundation. And in this series of books, there's a person called, a character called Harry Seldon. And Harry Seldon realizes from a kind of forecasting perspective that the world is about to go, actually the universe, because now we're talking about planets and galaxies and people travel all around the universe, that there will be a dark age, that there'll be a period of chaos and destruction, and that the world, the humanity will suffer. And so Harry Seldon cooks up a plan, and the plan has to do with being able to intervene effectively in history, to kind of steer, navigate in such a way that the Dark Ages, instead of lasting 10,000 years, only lasts 1,000 years. Now, this sounds very rational, very powerful, kind of clever thing to do. And the reason I tell this little story about Isaac Asimov Foundation and Harry Seldon is that it's a fantasy. And the power of these cultural stories, of these fantasies, is that we use them to structure the way we look at the world. And in a way, a story is almost too elaborate for some of what we're trying to do. But I think that the Harry Seldon story puts us in a position, in a relationship to the world around us, which is actually dangerous. And this is what I want to try and talk about when it comes to futures literacy, and explain a little bit about why I think futures literacy is so relevant now in the 21st century, given the conditions that we live in, given the way humanity has articulated and established its aspirations, what we hope for. But also the abilities that humanity now has to extend what we do. I don't see machines and tools and technology as something separate from humanity. it's an extension. We're in symbiosis with our tools. So obviously, because I'm presenting to you through a tool, the tools are extensions of us. And by the way, just to see this kind of plasticity, the stories we tell, what's acceptable, the use of telepresence, which is what we're doing right now, was certainly doable 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and it would have allowed me to be places that I could go to very easily through telepresence, but required a fairly large carbon footprint and also a lot of time if I had to be there face to face. Our attitudes change, the conditions change, what we imagine change, what's acceptable changes. And that's part of changing, unlearning some of the things that we take for granted. All of this for me fits into a very fundamental realization about complexity. And I want to just present the idea of what it means to get better at living with complex emergence. Now, to a certain extent, and this is very common, people say complexity. Oh dear, that's really, I wish things weren't so complex. From my point of view, mostly what they mean is complicated, because it's kind of like lots of different parts and pieces, and they wish they could reduce the number of pieces and control them better. Those are complicated things. Complex is not something we dial up or dial down. Complexity is really about a state. We live in a complex universe. It is complex, and we can't actually escape that. That complexity it is composed of really something quite simple in a way, which is there's repetition, things that repeat. Let's say the building that I'm in right now, it's going to sit there, it's concrete, it's going to repeat, and there's difference. The difference is sometimes I'll be in my office like I am now, and sometimes I won't. That's a difference. The universe consisting of repetition and difference opens the question of how do we make sense of that? How do we detect those repetitions and those differences? And we see, if we compare these two photos, the repetition and the difference. But there's also the unknown unknowns. And here, just taking a look at the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, the fields that were empty fields, and they decided to build Brasilia, you didn't know that was going to happen in that place and be created there the way it was. Unknown unknowns, let's say the internet or the atomic bomb or Google, words that we didn't even think about very long ago, and then they're there and they change what we see and what we do. How can we, find a way? And this is partly, I think, one of the key roles for the cultural sector, to help us tell stories and to help us situate ourselves, understand where we fit, articulate, be able to express our identity in a universe that is fundamentally, the only certainty is uncertainty. And instead of treating uncertainty as something evil that disturbs our plans, how do we get better at living in this creative universe? Can we think about changes in the conditions of change? So there are changes within the system. There are changes outside the system. And I mean things that we don't understand from where we're sitting now. And we can get inside in change. And a lot of us work with that. That's the kind of, in some ways, the Harry Seldon version, is that how to tweak the existing system so that it gets better. We often try to reform, to improve, to adapt, to make things that are sustainable from the point of view of continuity. There are outside in changes, meaning there's sometimes things that happen outside the existing system that influence the existing system. There are inside out changes, meaning there are things, for instance, let me just give you an example that now seems a little bit obvious and outdated. MOOCs, the kind of massive open online courses for education, for instance, that were the influence of the internet on the education system, and that created kind of also an influence of the education system on the internet. And today, of course, with us having to go beyond the classroom and do distance learning, we see that there's all sorts of things that we learn from education that we use in our distance and telepresence activities. Then there's outside out. Outside out is the kind of change that doesn't really have a name. I mean, to make big historical comparisons, there are changes that take place between different periods or different ways of organizing life. Let's take agricultural and industrial society, rural and urban society. It's very difficult. And I can think of my grandparents, for instance, who moved from Eastern Europe to Canada at the beginning of the 20th century. It's very difficult, impossible, in fact, for them to imagine what it would be like to go from a village, a rural agricultural village with no electricity, to a big city by their standards in Canada, and have to adapt, but in fact invent something that's completely outside their existing frame of reference. So how do we get better at that? This is where futures literacy comes in. And the reason that futures literacy is relevant as a capability, because futures literacy is a competency. It's not a specific method. It's a skill, really, a skill that's rooted in something very fundamental. All humans anticipate. And in fact, consciousness and anticipation are connected, but all organic biological entities anticipate. A tree anticipates when the leaves fall. A cat anticipates when it waits for a mouse. Humans anticipate when a baby cries to be fed. We anticipate when we cross the street. When we look to see if the cars are coming, they're not there yet, but we anticipate that they might. Anticipatory systems are very common, very, very general. We use them all the time, but we don't really think about them very much, and we don't design and try and structure different reasons for thinking about the future and different methods for thinking about the future. So just very quickly, the future does not exist in the present. It's not here now. I can't show you something from the future. I don't have a time machine. The form that the future takes in the present is anticipation. So one of the things to do is to say, how can we see that? How can we begin to understand better anticipation? And because people don't really talk about it that much, we have to find ways to make it more explicit, to make it more visible. That's why I put this image of the accelerator, which reveals atomic particles. There's a task, a challenge to understand anticipation, to make the invisible visible. And what this really involves is being able to distinguish two fundamental different ways, reasons for thinking about the future, or what I call two paradigms walking on two legs. Futures literacy allows us to see these two different paradigms and to use these two different paradigms. The poster here is a reference to the Maoist proposal that there were two paradigms, the industrial paradigm and the peasant paradigm, and they needed to work together. And I think it's true about futures literacy, is that to get better at using the future, reframing human agency, in other words, thinking the way we relate to our ability to see the world, perceive the world, and act in the world, we need to be able to understand that there are closed ways of thinking about the future, what we prepare for, contingent futures. That's like crises or emergencies or pandemics. What we attempt to create, what we plan for, the buildings, the investments we make, the bets we make, and open futures, what we discover, revealing what we did not know that we knew, new sense making, and inventing the unknowable. And we do this all the time, really, because we invent words, for instance, and they say, there's something here. What is it? What is this? I don't really have the right word for it. And then we invent the word for it. And of course, the cultural sector is doing this all the time. The cultural sector has the sensitivities, the antennae, tries to disconnect from the existing way of seeing and doing things and saying, what's provocative? What's different? What stirs my feelings? Why do I feel differently, or how do I feel passionately about something? And that inspires us to identify things. And sometimes we don't even give words to it, but we express those through dance or through music. So art is part of this capacity to distinguish search from choice. In other words, there's this bias that's quite powerful in our current world towards colonizing the future. We want to make bets. We want to win. We want to impose our ideas now on tomorrow and say, look, the way to create a safe future is to know what the future will be and make sure that it's the way we want it to be. But of course, the universe doesn't play by those rules, and we can either decide that we want to try and bend the universe to our desires, or realize that we need to become better able to connect to this richness that's uncertainty, this richness that's the unknowable before it happens, and be able to become better at perceiving it and making sense of it, which is very much what the cultural sector is all about. This paradigm shift, though, is pretty tricky. And so here I put up the flat Earth, round Earth, and the monsters that are associated with the flat Earth. And today it is very prevalent to think, look, the only way I can feel secure, the only way I can reduce anxiety and stress, is if I know what's going to happen. And so I want things to be certain, and I want somebody to tell me that they know what's going to happen and they will make it this way. And so then I'll feel relaxed and I'll feel comfortable and happy. But this is really an invitation to the kind of flat Earth way of thinking, which is the world is round, it's not flat. And so the monsters we have around uncertainty need to be changed. That's not an easy thing to do. Changing paradigms or working with two paradigms at once is not a simple task, because so much of our discourse, so many of our stories and our impressions, the things we fear, the things we hope for, are shaped by this way of thinking. And so if you believe that you can fall off the side of the earth, if you believe that you can reduce uncertainty to the point where it won't disturb you, the monsters you create, the fears you create, are not the same as if you say the world is round. And I will never get rid of uncertainty. The question is, how can I become better at integrating this unbelievable creativity that is the fundamental nature of the world around us into what I see and what I do? So futures literacy is about that. I think it's worth asking, well, what difference does it make? And I'll use again the paradigmatic and the kind of big picture comparison. This is the Ptolemaic system where the Earth is in the center and the sun goes around the Earth. And then, of course, the Copernican system shows us that the sun is in the center of our solar system, and that the Earth goes around the sun. Well, in a certain sense, when you wake up in the morning, it really makes no difference if you know where the sun is one place or another, and the earth is in one relationship to the sun or another. It really doesn't change anything we do in the morning. That's just something we know, but in practical terms, it has no impact. But maybe it does. And this is the point I think about futures literacy, is the capabilities, competencies, like being able to understand and analyze where the sun really is with respect to the earth, actually does change what we see. It changes what we imagine. It changes what we resist. It changes what we preserve. It changes how we preserve what we want to preserve. It changes the conditions of change. It alters the basic world around us. And so the story of futures literacy as a capability is really one of finding a different way of relating to the world around us. And I think it's a way that, and this is a very brilliant artistic expression of this idea by an artist called Sampé, which shows this kind of conventional notion, the conventional image of leadership, which says, the leader or the great plan or the brilliant vision or the ideology or the future industrial prosperity. How do we get from where we are now, poor or disrupted, to that wonderful future place? Somebody must lead us, and we have to have a plan, like the plan of that tightrope going across the precipice. But if you look at this image, I think you'll agree that it doesn't look very reassuring. It looks really kind of crazy. And this is the point, is that not integrating uncertainty, not becoming better at the ability to let go of the desire to know the future in order to be able to detect and invent the richness of the present actually sets humanity up for a lot of stress and anxiety that I think is unnecessary. So the point here is how we anticipate matters. It changes the present, and I think that's certainly what START is doing, which is responding, engaging, and attempting to connect the cultural sensations, expressions, experiences with the way in which we live in the present, which includes fundamentally how we anticipate. And what futures literacy is about is, and this is the unlearning to a certain extent, is that it changes the way we anticipate, and therefore it changes the present. Thank you very much.